Okay, so I can see some questions already coming. I don't want anyone to lose their train of thought. So I'm going to just begin taking questions now. I think there's already a lot for us to dissect here. Lorato, you I think had the first question. So I was wondering if you're comfortable, would you like to come on screen and speak with Dr. Ampiah directly, or would you like me to ask your question? If you do want to, just turn on your camera and unmute yourself and begin speaking. I'll give you a few moments.
I have to say it's extremely hot here, you know, that's why I have a towel with me.
Well, the heat of the weather, I think, is just matching the heat of our minds, you know, grappling with these ideas. Okay, Lorato, I don't think is going to come up, so I'm going to ask the question. I think we need to start by acknowledging that the issue of race is one of the challenges that keeps us in the same place in terms of growth. My question is very broad, as race encompasses issues of the economy. So my question is, how do we move forward from these challenges, not only in Africa, but globally? And secondly, how do we then, in ratification of race issues, do we include matters of economy?
Am I supposed to answer that?
Yeah, as briefly as one can.
You know, in one sense, it is very interesting when we have to talk about the economy and race. If we have to really see race as a very crucial factor in our situations. Appiah, in my talk, says that the way the industrialized world sees Africans is not positive, right? He says that. So it's interesting that he didn't say that the white world or the West world. In other words, the implication of that statement is that the Koreans may see Africans in a bad light. The Japanese may well do the same. The Chinese may well do the same. Nevertheless, these groups of people are not white, right? In other words, their race has not impeded them from creating better life chances for themselves. The question is, how do we deal with that if the emphasis is only on race? I don't know if that answers the question that was posed to me.
No, I think it definitely does, in trying to think about how within maybe the Black experience, you know, is not necessarily a microcosm for all experiences, where race might have a take. And actually, we're both in the UK, so I'm going to ask your opinion about this. I don't want to get too much into it because I know people have strong opinions, but just about the recent report that came out, the Sewell report, which seemed, so for those of you who don't know, there was a recent report in the UK which said essentially that institutional racism is no longer with us. And I think one of even those people who didn't disagree with the numbers at the base of the study, which seemed to show that on some measures, African immigrants or Black immigrants were doing better than indigenous white working class people, particularly in areas such as education and representation in some of the professions. Even people who did not dispute some of those raw numbers said that, well, that doesn't translate to the qualitative Black experience, that even where, for example, you may have economic advancement, you still live within this structure, this construct where race is important. Do you think Appiah, you know, considers this as well, that there is something beyond the Marxist view of the world where race is important, It's not just, you can't just reduce it down to this sort of industrial world and non-industrial world.
Well, in his works, he very clearly states that there is racism. Of course he does. But then I suppose he could also be posing a question like, if racism was that universal, then how is it that China, for example, or the Chinese have been able to upgrade themselves economically, even as they contend in the global economy and against the West? Which would be a relevant question to ask. But the truth of the matter is that the Chinese experience and the African experience are not identical, right? I mean, we can sort of explore that to show where the differences are, but I suppose we can conclusively say that the experiences of the Chinese and the Africans are not in any way identical.
Thank you. I'm going to push through with some more questions. Krista, I think yours was just a point, so I'm going to push past that. And Nigel, I hope you won't mind. I'm just going to reserve your question just to try to get some of the other questions in. I think I'm trying to keep track of things, but I think it's Professor Knight, and then I think it was Pearl Robinson afterwards. I can see the hands as well. So I'm just going to firstly ask Professor Knight if he wants to ask his question, or if he's happy for me to ask it. I'll give you a moment to start your camera if you'd like to. If not, I'll go ahead and ask it. Okay, I shall ask it. Okay, so from Professor Knight, can we therefore speak of a cosmopolitan Pan-Africanism that can conceptually be distinguished from the old traditional Pan-Africanism?
Well, that's what Appiah seems to be saying. He's concerned that the old forms of Pan-Africanism is dragging Africa down. And I suppose if you were to pose a question like you did to him, he would say, well, what he's interested in is a cosmopolitan form of Pan-Africanism. I mean, his emphasis, or he has actually mentioned or talked about how it doesn't make any sense to exclude white South Africans from the project of Pan-Africanism. And of course, there are people who would be very happy and determined to do that. And you know, from his point of view, from Appiah's point of view, that would not in any way favor the project. In the same way that I suppose he would say to you that perhaps his mother was more a Pan-Africanist than his father was. And his mother was white. I can't hear you.
Apologies, I'm so sorry. I know we're going to have Professor Picciano with us a little bit later on in the series, but just taking that example about white South Africans and Black South Africans, and is there anything in Appiah's work where he looks at, you know, whether it's within the anti-apartheid movement or in any other liberation movement, where scholars have considered the role of white liberalism or the problem of white liberalism or white liberals, that when push comes to shove, sometimes the racial identity or racial, you know, how people classify themselves is often too much for people to get over and really truly become part of the liberation movement. Does he consider that in his work?
I haven't come across anything that he's written about that, but I think I could probably reflect on that question. I mean, my personal position on this is that, and I did sort of mention this in passing in my talk, when I refer to Appiah as a flamboyant liberal. The point is liberalism emphasizes capitalist forms of development. And my personal take on this, based on my knowledge of history, is that of course, capitalism is exploitative. And we know this from history. I mean, there are people who probably wouldn't agree with the point that the origins of capitalism starts with slavery. And of course, if slavery grew capitalism, then we've got to be very suspicious of that institution, right? Now, the liberal ethos and its emphasis on capitalist development is something that, in the grand scheme of things, would quite clearly not favor the economic development of a developing country. And we know, at least, you know, from the 1960s, that developing economies have always struggled in the marketplace against the dominance and indeed the hegemony of fully grown capitalist states. And because of that awareness, there is also a role that, as some people have told us, the government can play in the development of fledgling or developing economies. In other words, a government has to step in to make sure that its economy is not taken advantage of by the advanced economies. But of course, the liberal would tell you that the economy has to be free, and then also say the economy has to be fair at the same time, which incidentally does not add up. And Appiah obviously believes in capitalist development as a form of growing the national economy. And from my perspective, that is problematic. In other words, it's never a level playing ground between a developing economy and a fully fledged capitalist economy.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really, really important point about also the words in terms such as fairness and equality. If they're not historically kind of put in context, then we're not all starting from the same position. So now I'd like to come to Pearl Robinson, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So first of all, Professor Ampiah, I just thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. And I don't really have a question. What I would like to do is to sort of share with the group the first time I met Kwame Appiah. At the time, so it was when he was at Harvard, and I live in Boston, but he was the chair of the Joint Committee on African Studies, and I had just been invited to join. He invited me to have dinner with him the night before our first meeting. And of course, people talked about him and one had heard about him. So the first question I asked him was, what should I call you? He immediately said, Kwame. For me, that established an identity. I never actually heard anybody refer to him as Kwame. It was either Anthony or Tony. He then shared with me much of what you said in your introduction. Talked a bit about his father, that his father had worked with Nkrumah in the early days, and Nkrumah ended up putting his father in jail. Talked about his mother, who, as you say, at that point, he says, she's just a gung-ho Jerry Rollins, African. And he told me he was working on a book with her about her, based on her collection of gold weight proverbs. So he talked about that. Then for whatever reason, I asked him, he had siblings. He told me his siblings, and he shared with me the nationality of each of his siblings. And then, as you said, he's British. he told me about when he met the Queen. The Queen, he was a sickly child. He was in hospital. The Queen visited Ghana and he was in the hospital bed. And he talked about how she could have conversation with just about anybody. And so at the end, I thought to myself, he introduced me to a person who's not known in the world that I lived in as a scholar. He's, for whatever reason, maybe because he figured out I was interested, he wanted to share with me who he is. We had one more meeting. We had a meeting in Boston and he hosted it at his apartment in the South End in Boston. And so I was sort of commenting on the things that he had in his house. And I said, this is a gorgeous chair. It's a carved wooden chair. He said, this was my father's chair. And this was about a year before In My Father's House came out. Right. So what I knew, and we went to a meeting in London and he and I sat next to each other in a very tight Virgin Airlines seat. But we had a number of hours to talk about his experiences in London. And so what I actually think is the person who made the comment about cosmopolitan Pan-Africanism. The Appiah I got to know is a person who at the very core sees himself as African. And in his philosophy and his writings, he is writing the African he is and saying, I am an authentic African and there's more than one way of being there. So your presentation of him, I think, captured that better than anything I have heard since that day I asked him, what should I call you?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. As a matter of fact, his middle name, Anthony, is a bastardization of an Akan name, Antro.
Interesting. And the one thing I forgot to add, when we went to the meeting the next day, everybody was calling him Tony as a term of affection, like I really know you. And in a way, we had this shared knowing of that what they were doing was inauthentic.
Right, interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that with me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pearl, for sharing that with all of us. Such a wonderful, wonderful oral history. It's just brilliant. I think everybody enjoyed hearing that and seeing the real man behind the work as well. So thank you to everybody who has their hands up, who's dropped their messages in the comments. I'm noting everybody's order. I hope I don't mess anything up, but please do hang tight. Don't forget your question. We will get to you. We've got loads of time. We've got about 40 minutes left. So
how long did I talk for? I didn't keep track.
Oh, no, you were good. You were good. I think it's just a lively room. So now, Winston, I think you were next. If I don't hear from you, I'll go ahead and ask your question. Okay. So Winston says, is Pan-Africanism more an issue of power in politics than the morals of race?
Well, I suppose Appiah would say yes. It's more about power, and he would refer to it as the old form of Pan-Africanism, which he would like to have changed. But he raises interesting issues about what he refers to as the old form of Pan-Africanism. The questions that I raised in regards to, the disabled and how they're treated in Africa. Of course, gender issues in Africa, and the question of how African countries treat gay and lesbian people. I mean, there are countries, I suppose, that if Appiah were to find himself there, flaunting his identity as a gay person, would probably end up in in jail. So that raises interesting questions and very important questions about how he, as an individual and a thinker, would think about Africa as a whole, and indeed individual countries in Africa who obviously treat people like him in a way that dehumanizes him.
Yeah, I actually, when I was reading your work, I thought of this idea of the sort of the hierarchy. What did I put it as now? Sorry, the hierarchy of causes in a movement. That do you just focus all of your attention on that one thing that seems so important, or do you try to address many things simultaneously?
Right. That's an interesting point. I haven't come across that in his work, but the point is, a movement has to be treated or has to see itself as an institution, and has to take on what I call a bureaucratic responsibility of duties. In other words, of course, there might be a primary objective, but it doesn't mean that other relevant issues would be ignored. Every institution would have within itself divisions that would take care of, desperate issues and problems. And in that sense, every issue ought to be treated as important and relevant, as long as those issue or that issue reflects on the dignity of a person or persons.
Okay, I guess getting back to that humanist core then in his ideology. So I think Baba was here, but I can't see his hand up anymore. So please, I'm not sure if we've answered your question in the meantime, but please don't give up. Don't give up on us. Raise your hand. I did definitely see it. But I'd now like to go to Kofi, and please ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much for the brilliant expose of some of the thought of Appiah. My question to Professor Ampiah is the following. Have you come across within the work of Professor Appiah the idea or an ideal about philosophies of African futures? So let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. I'm sort of a futurist. I'm looking at African futures, and I'm doing some work on what are the philosophies and the ideas that make Africans think about the way they look at the future. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons is a lot of us have been really sort of being a bit blasé because a great deal of the younger group, if I may say so, are probably overwhelmed by history. What I call the tyranny of the past. Mm-hmm. You've got to be able to quote Du Bois, you got to be able to quote, Blyden, you've got to be able to know all these people. And there's a generation of people saying, wait a minute, that tyranny of the future, the past is just on us. Is there a focus on African futures? What are the governing philosophies of Professor Appiah that you know of, if you've come across, that help us to start to project ourselves in the future, a little bit the way that Kwame Nkrumah did when he wrote his book on the future of Africa? Is there such a thing? Have you come across such a thing, an ideal that really help us, or at least how Africans see or design or think about tomorrow, rather than just the past?
Right. With specific reference to Appiah, I have to confess, no, I haven't come across that. But we have a quorum here. There are great minds here. I think this is something that we can talk about collectively, I think. So if there's anyone out there who can respond to that directly, I suppose we can start with that.
that also deals with the idea of dreaming about tomorrow for Africans. Are there such things? Do Africans have a different way of dreaming about tomorrow? I mean, so much so that we can start to sort of expand a bit. What would the future look like for Africa in the next 25 years, 50 years? I'm not saying as the Chinese are doing it, but as other people are doing it, you know, a bit of a focus on how do we see tomorrow and how do we design it today, rather than, for the most part, the conversation on the tyranny of the past, that past that completely overwhelms us, but most of us don't understand much, or people just say, look, this is in the past. I can't figure out what these guys are talking about.
Right.
Can we start from somewhere and design that future today?
But you know, in one sense, I mean, I can understand what you're saying, but in one sense, there is also wisdom in having knowledge of the past. Not least because we don't want to, as it were, repeat the mistakes of the past. If you don't have knowledge of the past or the mistakes of the past, then conceivably you could be repeating those mistakes again, right? So that awareness of the past is also very important. I mean, and that falls within the remit of history. You've got to be able to understand what happened in history so that we can move forward, as it were, not to repeat the mistakes that we did in the past. I mean, that I suppose is a useful starting point for any forms of transformation and development.
I would agree with you. But when the past becomes a choking yoke and it becomes a tyranny that overwhelms us and we're so frozen, our reference is just in that point. Now, our reference point is regularly looking backward. And sometimes we forget to figure out, how do we design tomorrow? So my question there was to figure out, you know, how do we do it in neo-Pan-Africanism or Pan-Africanism of today, so that we could say to not just to the youth, but the people who are listening to us, all right, we know the past was a great reference point and we enjoyed it. We're not repeating it. We're learning from it. We've learned from it. But now, can we get a sense where there is a point where we can also use Pan-Africanism and its lessons to look into tomorrow? And how is that playing according to the kind of work that Appiah has done, but also on your own viewpoint about that?
Well, I suppose in that respect, I would just make reference to what Appiah says about the old forms of Pan-Africanism. And he would argue, I suppose, that the old forms are choking Africans and Africa. And he would, in that regard, be more interested in the new form of Pan-Africanism. And that new form would divest itself of race or race-related issues. I mean, that's what I take from what he's writing. In other words, we have to be able to grab whatever is out there that would be positive for the development of Africa. And you know, central to his work, his thesis, is modernization. And that's what he's interested in. But of course, his idea about modernization would be essentially European modernization, which in so many different ways raises all sorts of questions for us, you know, because one of the things that I am very much aware of and concerned about is the fact, for example, that as we all know, or we should know, the center of capitalism is moving to East Asia. Yeah, quite clearly, China is, you know, en route to become the hegemonic center of the world. Now, if capitalism is the basis for national growth and development And now we see that a new form of hegemony is coming up. Do we, or should we get worried that, or should we pray, perhaps, that China as a hegemonic entity would not do to Africa what the Europeans did to Africa? Well, in a sense, that takes us back to the past, you see. Is it conceivable that the Chinese, with their forms of capitalism, may do to Africa and perhaps other countries like Africa what the Europeans did to Africa from the 16th century? I don't think that's an irrelevant question to ask, which brings into perspective the history that we already have about how exploitative capitalism or the European civilizations were in relation to Africa.
Mm. A wonderful point. I think there's even in speaking with people, and anecdotally in my own experience, there seems to be a fear when people are seeing some of the investment decisions on the ground about whether or not we're having a different type of colonialism on the continent. So I think these are really pertinent questions. I'd like to go to Alan, who's put his question in the chat, but Pearl, I did see your hand up again, so I'm not sure if it was the same hand.
It was up and I was trying to put my question in the chat, but it looks like I directed it to one person. So I actually just wanted to speak to the person who, and I think it was the person who was talking about future, Kweku Ampiah. Yeah. What are your ideas? It seemed to me that you have been thinking about this. So it would be, I think, useful for us to hear some of your ideas. Actually started thinking about this 30 years ago. And I would just quickly say it's in terms of scenario plane, alternative African futures, and spelling out alternative futures based on the assumption that in at least some of these alternative futures, Africa has agency. But I really would be interested in knowing what you're talking about. And obviously sounds like something that more people need to do. And if one can connect it with the past, because in fact, better futures will depend upon understanding the past.
Yes.
Then we have the way forward.
Kofi, I'm not sure if you want to think of your answer, and I'll just
that's fine. I may come later, but in fact, I just wanted to sort of disclose that I've been trying to get in touch with Professor Appiah to interview him for some work I'm doing, because I think there seems to be a bit of a gap into that future space about Pan-Africanism. At least this is something I feel that need to be filled. But I will share some ideas later if there's room.
Thank you so much. So Alan, I thought socialism was projected as one of the key ideologies of Pan-Africanism, hence African socialism, etc. Moreover, I thought the ideals in socialism seek to address the salient issues that Professor Appiah claims are being ignored in the intrinsic racists, etc. So first question is that a mistaken thought that I hold? So I think I'll ask you that question first.
Please, can you repeat the question?
I thought socialism was projected as one of the key ideologies of Pan-Africanism, hence African socialism, etc. Moreover, I thought the ideals in socialism seek to address the salient issues that Professor Appiah claims are being ignored by the intrinsic racists, etc., etc. Is that a mistaken thought I hold?
Well, as far as I understand, Appiah is a liberal. He believes in the operations of liberal capitalism. And therefore, I think that he would not be particularly interested in the socialist forms of economic development. That is my understanding.
Thank you.
I mean, for one thing, we know for a fact that Appiah is very critical of the Nkrumah administration and the Nkrumah government. I mean, he may be critical of that administration and the government for different reasons, but I think one of the reasons why he's critical of it was because of the socialist policies of the Nkrumah administration.
Thank you. I have one question, so it's another question, he says. I have one question in addition. Nkrumah et al. Talked about the African personality. This was defined in a racial sense by the negritude movement. However, Nkrumah defined it in a different way, as validity of traditional statecraft, socialist conception of human development, etc. Does Professor Appiah discuss the notion of the AP, so African personality, and how does he define it?
I'm sorry, I haven't come across anything that he's written about that.
Okay, so sorry, Alan, nothing to add there, but that just is the case. I'm just going to go back to, if I can find it now, I hope I can. Nigel had a question before, which he very kindly allowed me to skip. So I'll go back to that. So Nigel's question is, can we therefore speak of a cosmopolitan Pan-Africanism that can conceptually be distinguished? I feel like I've asked this one. Did I ask? Was that your first question?
No, I haven't heard that.
Yeah, that was Andy's question. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay.
Andy sent it to me, and then I sent it back into the chat. But no, you did answer that.
Can I answer that?
You did.
Yeah. Thank you, Nigel, for confusing me.
No.
But please, we do have about 20 minutes left with Dr. Ampiah, so more than enough time to take your questions. And please do hold on. I know people have to run off to do various things. If you do have a question and you have your hand up and you have to run off, then just help me pop it into the chat, because then we can still pose the question. And then if you have time, once the video is released, you can see your question answered. But while some more questions come in, I'll just pose a few of my own. One of the things that I guess it kind of goes to this idea back to this idea of utility of race as a concept. Does Professor Appiah not, or is there any room in his theory for the idea that through the struggle, in the fire, what goes in becomes something different? So he seems to say, with all these sort of disparate peoples that go through a process, and the process doesn't homogenize us, and that any kind of idea that we become one thing is really a fallacy. But does he mistake, or does he ignore the fact that by going through the process, those sort of ingredients that went into the system come out, and there's something new and different, and that it might not be possible to separate out what has been forged in? So does he discount, I guess, the fact that the processes of subjugation, the processes of denigration have created a very real blackness that people are loath to relinquish?
Yeah, well, I suppose in one sense he admits that, and I did talk about the Nazi experience there. He admits that Nazi racism, to some extent, cohered a certain kind of, I suppose, identity for Black people, in the sense that they came to realize that, well, as a matter of fact, the Europeans are not nice to each other. I mean, if they could kill their own people to that extent, then, as I was arguing, then of course, Black people would collectively see the Europeans rather differently, and disregard this whole idea of the European civilization that is so modern and therefore universal, right? So that's one point. So there is something out of that in a sense congeals a certain kind of political awareness. Whether that then becomes something that is relevant in the racial sense of the idea is, I believe, something that Appiah would not agree with. So the idea, the process as you're talking about would be, or will provide us with a certain kind of political awareness, but that does not necessarily have to be associated with race or race-related issues.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We've got another question that's come in from Emmanuel, and he asks, are there any specific books that Professor Appiah has authored which are critical of Pan-Africanism?
Well, the main book is his monograph, In My Father's House. And that book explores Pan-Africanism quite extensively. So that's the one that I would recommend.
Great. So I hope Emmanuel, you got that one. And please do keep the questions coming. If not, you're just going to hear my questions, which I know you need a diversity of questions. But I've got another one. I've got a million questions, so don't worry. We're never going to run out. Never going to run out. So Dr. Appiah seems to allude, when he's talking about Du Bois, he seems to allude to Du Bois being trapped in some sort of delusion, the delusion that he has or should have a particular affinity to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking a lot about race, but does Appiah ever suggest that there can be a manifestation of Pan-Africanism that does not center Africa? After all, the Yoruba claim origin from Ile-Ife, Ashanti have an affinity to Kumasi. So what is so wrong about a Pan-Africanism that notes a spiritual and psychological affinity with Africa?
He talks about Pan-Africanism in the New World. He talks about that. He seems to accept that there could be a sort of a political movement that would, in a sense, try to create better life chances for people in the diaspora. But he contends that, or he argues that, there is no reason why there should be that umbilical cord between Africa and the diaspora. So that's a point that he makes. But to be honest with you, I don't agree with that, you know. I don't agree with that in the sense that somehow there is a tendency on the part of people to want to be familiar with people who, in one sense, perhaps looks like them or seem to have the same forms of cultural patterns of behavior like them. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm taking a cue from my experience with Japan, for example, and with respect to an example that all of a sudden became, you know, relevant to the Japanese government in the 1980s, when all of a sudden the Japanese started inviting people of Japanese descent in the Americas to come and live or to go and live in Japan. I mean, the question is, why didn't they invite Indians in the subcontinent of India to go and live in Japan? Why didn't they do that? Instead, they went for people whom they thought looked like the Japanese to go and live in Japan. Except that when these people, hundreds of thousands of them, arrived in Japan, all of a sudden the Japanese then realized that, oh, after all, these people don't really look like us. They don't behave like us, that is. The mannerism was completely different. So the tendency for people to reach out towards people who look like them seems to be a very natural one. And I think Appiah should understand that. And I believe he understands that. But then to move on from that, you know, to accept that, and then to move on from that to say that, okay, we are going to exclude people who don't look like us, is what he sees as a problem. Because politically speaking, you could agree with someone who doesn't necessarily have your features or look like you. Yeah, I mean, that's conceivably possible.
Yes, it's very interesting. I'd like to just pick your brains a little bit on this diaspora continental point, because it seems as if Dr. Appiah is himself trapped in a dichotomy that I think many of us, like myself in the diaspora, know, particularly in the new diaspora, the more recent diaspora, this doesn't exist. Though you are in the diaspora, you're still very much connected to the continent, whether financially through remittances, visiting, family are still there. So does he ignore that the African diaspora is not, in the way it behaves, actually disconnected from the continent, especially the new diaspora sort of post-World War II?
That they're not disconnected, you mean?
Yes.
Well, I don't think that he's saying that they are in any way disconnected. His point of reference is this idea of cosmopolitanism. In other words, you have a right to be connected. You have a right to be connected. Whether you're Black or not, you could be connected to Africa, he says. So the point he's making is that it doesn't have to be based on the color of the skin of the person. In other words, the world should be free to the extent that people should be, I suppose if you gave them a chance, people should be able to live wherever they want. He talks eloquently about the fact that he feels very free in New York. And I'm inclined to think that he probably feels more free in New York than in London. I said in my talk that he has a British passport. I suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect he has an American passport as well. Okay? I believe that he feels very liberated in New York. And that's probably because of his lifestyle, perhaps because of his sexuality. Yeah? And that's all part and parcel of his identity anyway. I don't suppose he will feel liberated living in Kampala, for example. And Kampala is in Africa, you know? And he is African. Why would he, in a sense, assume the identity of a Ugandan just because he is African, when living in Kampala or anywhere in Uganda for that matter could be a problem for him?
Yeah.
So the factor of race here doesn't matter at all as far as his freedom is concerned.
Okay. Very, very powerful points. And I think somebody mentioned that they do believe he's an American citizen. So Kai, I saw your hand up. I'm not sure if you would like to ask your question yourself. I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry, there's a little bit of like noise in the background, but I can briefly, sorry I'm late. I definitely want to be here on time, but my question is, since we're talking about this, I'm very interested in this connection between the diaspora and the continent. So my question is, what, if any, impact do you think being Western educated, which I think that, which I think Appiah is, what do you think that being Western educated has, how has it impacted this perspective that the diaspora shouldn't necessarily have like this umbilical cord? Because I feel like that's something that's particularly Western with like the Enlightenment, which is the Enlightenment movement, which was like about this sort of disconnection from like culture and things that are not considered like rational and very individualistic, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering what kind of impact you think being Western educated had on this particular perspective.
Are you suggesting that because of his Western education, he's disassociated from Africa? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I don't think he's disassociated from it, but I think that Western education, in my experience, because I'm also being Western educated, you're often encouraged to think separate from like your, I don't want to say like inherent, like separate from your identity, I feel like. I think that when you're going through Western institutions, from the language that you use to the sorts of sourcing your thought to think of, you're often, pressured to think outside of like your own identity and your own kind of like circle. So I'm wondering if you think that is relevant to his experience.
Well, you see, Appiah says that identities are imagined, they are created, they're fabricated, they are manipulated, right? So, in that sense, an identity is like a piece of cloth that you put on, which you may take off sometime later and put on a new one. This idea of Western education and the point that you're making that it could cause a problem for someone like you if you wanted to interact more with Africa is, I believe, overstretched, because you could have the same sort of problem living in an African country and I suppose feeling disengaged from your parents or your siblings because, as you would put it, because you are involved in a Western form of education. I personally don't really understand what that means, because generations would, of course, acquire patterns of behavior that are not necessarily identical with those of their parents, for example. Yeah, so these things are constant in our lives, and to essentialize it and make it look as if because you have had a Western education, therefore you will be disengaged from a certain place or a continent is I think a little bit overstretched, not least because these forms of problems are everywhere. These forms of problems are everywhere.
I don't know. I think it's, I wouldn't say it's unique to the West, but again, my experience, even like maybe it's just a personal experience then of just like going through Western education for my whole life. It seems that any kind of attempt that you make to kind of like personalize your work and connect it to something that's not objective. I guess that's the word I'm looking for, like something that's not in like objective reality, because like you said, identities are imagined. So things that are not tied to objective reality is sort of rejected, I feel like, in Western education, where I've had friends who've been educated outside of that, and their culture, their understanding of their identity is specifically ingrained in the curriculum, so to speak. And I think that, maybe Western's too broad of a term. Maybe I'm thinking about American education system, where, most of the literature that, going through high school, going through middle school was about particularly like a majority like white people. So maybe it's something that's particularly American, not necessarily Western, but maybe again, it's a personal experience.
Right. I personally, I think that, identity evolves, and the fact that someone has had a certain kind of education should, and this is one of the things that Appiah talks about, should not feel distracted to the point where that person would not feel that they belong to a particular place or other. And it also relates to the fact that, I mean, the same sort of problem could be, I suppose, observed within, let's say, Nigeria, for example, in the sense that, you know, I have a nephew, for example, who, to a very large extent, obviously because of his education, does not necessarily, you know, believe in the sort of things that his father would say, for example. And maybe you could say that, well, you know, this young man is disengaged from the family, but then he's got friends in Ghana who think like he does. So that's why I was saying that, of course, generations would acquire certain patterns of behavior based on the education that they're exposed to that's different from the generation before them. And that's how we have to see it. I believe that that's how we have to see it. And then the other issue that I have with this is this idea of Western education. As opposed to what? I'm not quite sure. Because, you know, in Ghana, what students learn is essentially taken from Western education. And it's the same, I presume, in Jamaica, even in China, incidentally. Of course, the textbooks that they use there would be, you know, designed to, you know, respond to certain local problems. But in the main, the whole world, in one sense, revolves around the idea of Western education. Effectively, what I'm saying is that I think this idea of Western education is hopelessly overrated. And in one sense, some people would actually say something to the effect that modernization distracts or removes a community or a country from its traditions. They say that all the time. Because a country is modernized and therefore it's lost track of its traditions. So that for me is also yet another problem. I have difficulties with that in the sense that, of course, modernization brings in new ideas and new forms of thinking, but it will never replace the traditions of the country. That would never happen. It can never happen. We see people talk about how, for example, they will constantly mention that the Japanese, for example, have been able to modernize and keep their traditions as well. I don't know if anyone has come across that sort of phraseology, but they say that quite often about Japan. And my response constantly is that that's nonsense. Of course, they've modernized and kept their traditions, but that happens to every country. You know, the Germans modernized after, I suppose, taking their cue from the English, and we still know that the Germans are different from the English. In other words, they kept their traditions. And that is also why we talk about the Italians, because they're not like the English, but they've also modernized. The point is that they did not divorce themselves from their traditions. The traditions might have transformed, but they're still there. And therefore, I am never scared of this idea that, you know, a country is going to modernize and forget its traditions. It doesn't matter how hard the country tries, it will never succeed. And China is a very good example of this. During the period of the Mao regime, for years, the Chinese government tried to get rid of these Chinese traditions. I mean, if you said anything about Confucius, for example, you'd probably be put in jail in China in those days. And we've all heard about the Cultural Revolution, which was all designed about around getting rid of these Chinese patterns of behavior, as they call them. Now the Chinese are resurrecting, that's the word that I should use, their traditions. So we know, for example, that everywhere in the world now, the Chinese are building what they call the Confucius Institute. That's the bedrock of Chinese traditions. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, this is happening because China is modernizing. In other words, as they are modernizing, they are retracing their steps to retrieve their traditions.